Hello, everybody. This is Georgianne Hughes, and this is The Bite Show. And we're very blessed to have Douglas Riggs with us. And I would ask the listeners, please go to The Bite Show, go to the audio library, click on Douglas Riggs' name, and his page will open up, and scroll down, and please read his bio. It's very important that you read his bio. And you can email Douglas Riggs at this address. It is DW _Riggs, RIGGS, at Verizon.net. And with that, we're going to get started. This is going to involve SRA, DID, and Dr. Joseph Mengele. Hi, Douglas.
Hi, Georgianne. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Oh, yes.
And I want to thank also those that have been willing to come on tonight. There's some of the folks here at Morning Star. There's Dan and Susan and Julie and Sally. And we have also a person who lives in New Jersey, goes to assembly there where her pastor, James, is the pastor. And she's been working on her SRA DID issues for probably at least 14, 15 years at least. I first met Barbara back in the latter 90s when Pastor James came to us from Tulsa. And also, I forgot to mention Connie Constantina. She's here, so I didn't mean to forget Connie. But so we have her here. But as I was saying, with reference to Barbara, she's had quite a journey, and she's actually the half sister of Dan in terms of the royal bloodline that she came out of. Excuse me. So we have a representation here of the O'Collins dynasty, and that which, of course, is well known in terms of the Windsor dynasty and Great Britain now. Their current power and position in the Satanic Kingdom is, of course, it's propped up, if you will, if I could use that term, with the O'Collins bloodline. But the O'Collins is the oldest Druidic bloodline in the world. It's according to Frank Collins, it goes back to 4,500 years. So what we're going to be talking about tonight, I think, is somewhat historical. Is the person that maybe some of the younger people have never heard of, but most people who have any connection with history and World War II are familiar with Dr. Joseph Mengele, who is the notorious angel of death, who of course, he got 2 degrees, 2 doctorates. He studied under Professor von Verschuer, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and he, of course, studied various disciplines, anthropology, but he went into under Verschuer, von Verschuer. He went under the research head of eugenics and how to create a pure racial bloodline in Germany. The Nazi doctors, of course, were notorious as really leading the way of trying to bring about the purification of the Germanic people and creating a pure Aryan bloodline. And so I thought, just by way of an introduction, I have a book in front of me. It's probably one of the most definitive works on that particular era of history, and especially the Nazi doctors. And the book I have in front of me is titled The Nazi Doctors, Medical Killing and the Psychology of Genocide by Robert J. Lifton, which was released in 1985. It's over 500 pages, and it's quite an exhaustive history of just who the Nazi doctors were and their mindset, which is, you really can't put your mind around what these people, what they represent. But chapter 17, Robert J. Lipton titles it this way: Dr. Auschwitz, Joseph Mengele. And it's interesting that that's how he describes Dr. Mengele, as Dr. Auschwitz. And in the opening of this chapter, it reads like this: the SS man from Mein Kampf, very righteous and puritanical. This is Auschwitz prisoner doctor. Another quotation from an Auschwitz prisoner doctor is, quote, he was capable of being so kind to the children, to have them become fond of him, to bring them sugar, to think of small details in their daily lives, and to do things we would generally admire. And then, next to that, the crematoria smoke. And these children, tomorrow or in a half an hour, he is going to send them there. Well, that is where the anomaly lay. And so it is quite incredible that this individual got away with what he perpetrated. He was never captured by the Israeli Mossad, although they were close on his heels on a number of occasions, but he was never captured. And so I just thought I would just begin with allowing Dan. I don't remember if it was Sally or when we first heard reports of Dr. Joseph Mengele's involvement and being hired by various members of the royal family to actually do the trauma-based mind control, the programming as it's called. But I think I first heard of Mengele back in the 90s as we were working with various people who are now in their 50s or early 60s. Yeah, when I first heard of Mengele, I began to check around to see if anyone else had come across him as a programmer. And I remember first mentioning to Dr. Tom Hawkins, who is now with the Lord, he had not heard of it. In fact, as I began to report the extensive involvement of Dr. Joseph Mengele in terms of trauma-based mind control with the people I've been working with, and not only in Morningstar, but in other places where I was traveling throughout the United States, he began to think it was just, a Doug Riggs phenomenon. But after about 2 years, in fact, I just told Tom when we were discussing this one time, I said, well, Tom, maybe you haven't gotten deep enough into the people you're working with. Because if some of these people are members of the royal family, or the European royalty as it's referred to, I think sooner or later you're going to find it. Well, about 2 years later, after I discussed this with him, I got a call from Tom. He says, do you have a picture of Mengele? I said, yes, I do. He said, would you fax it to me? And I said, yeah. And I said, why? And he says, there's a person here that says that Mengele was involved in her programming. And so we just talked about, just having him lay some pictures out there on the table. Just pictures, 4, 5, or 6 sets of pictures. Just include the picture of Mengele and see what happens without any names. So he laid several pictures out on a table and then introduced the fax that I sent him. And when this woman saw Dr. Mengele, she immediately curled up in the fetal position and was unable to speak. She was in a place. She really regressed into a place of abject terror. And I will just have to say, in my experience with working with the people here, Georgianne, and all those who are listening, is that what he has done, and there are other programmers too. There's Dr. John Bowlby, who was interfaced with Mengele in terms of the attachment theory, and I think Jean Piaget. They are no longer here, and of course he trained a number of doctors that I won't get into tonight that have taken his place and actually refined some of the protocols. But as I said earlier, I thought I'd just begin with Dan, because I'll never forget as we were working with Dan back in the 90s, he had never, I don't think, Dan, you'd really read anything about Mengele, but you had memories of him, if I remember correctly. you had memories of Mengele at the time. You didn't even know it was Mengele until a certain amount of work we had done and working with undoing the trauma in you, and then it became apparent that this is the man that you had spent some considerable time with. So, Dan, why don't you just open up with whatever is on your heart as to when you think of Mengele, what does he represent in your life?
For me, about at 18 months, we worked, just working backwards, at 18 months, I just began to have memories of this man who sang over me and played the piano and has just a very melodic voice, and it was very tender toward me. And after working around that for a degree of time, I believe the Lord just showed me that it was Dr. Mengele, and then when I saw a picture of him, I knew it was him. I recognized. And again, it was a picture of him early on that time, and I had never read anything about Mengele, or I knew the word Auschwitz. I think probably from having heard it used as far as the camps and things, but I'd never read anything. I didn't know anything about Mengele as far as having read or studied or anything else, but the memories that I had, which are very, very distinct and clear because they were dissociated off, but and I said that he's the closest thing to a father I ever knew. My biological father did not, I think specifically and purposefully did not have any touching or anything like that. And the surrogate father in whose home I grew up never, ever touched or hugged or anything. He was just utterly and absolutely passive and just not there. So out of all the years, the only person, especially at the young years, that represented anything of like a fatherly figure was Mengele. I believe I was with him for a year to a year and a half. And it was, of course, not every moment with him, but with him, and I think we traveled, or he traveled and took me with him during that time. But and even there's still even a bit of a dichotomy. There's that in me which remembers almost affectionately Yosef Mengele and the way he sang over me and was tender, and yet there was that which represented the darkness of the abuse, the acts of darkness that represented being taken into a state of physical death and then being brought back through resuscitation. I know that he oversaw that, but it's as if he's there but not there. Just at that young age, having two aspects around the same person put into place so that there is a dichotomy. It's him, but it's not him. Just still, once I did come to the point where I believed that it was Mengele, then I began to read about him, and I was very shocked to find that the historical accounts of who he is and what he did matched very, very perfectly with my memory, especially the fact that he loved to play the piano. He loved the classical type, and also he sang, and even reading about the accounts in the camps of how he treated the children, it fit with the person that I had memories of.
Yes. Well, whoever's next to you, whoever wants to come up, just introduction in terms of what some of you ladies have in terms of memory, and I thought maybe let some of the ladies go and hear, and then of course Barbara, at any particular point you can come in, but we have, want to give all of you time to, at least introduce what stands out in your memory regarding Mengele interfacing with your life.
Hi, this is Sally, and the main thing that I remember is just looking at him and seeing just the epitome of evil. that his heart, he was just evil through and through. There was a blackness, the very depth of evil that connected to hell itself. And I believe that he could be embodied and instructed by Satan through Satan's intelligence, linking up to him as using and doing the program. And just like God designed man to be inhabited by God and himself, Joseph Mengele emulated the exact opposite of that, where he could be totally inhabited and controlled by Satan himself in the ingeniousness of the programming, and to link a corporate web. I believe that Satan used him to do the very structures, the very basics of the programming in linking and setting the foundation of the Nephilim project as well. His main way that he would do that would be through bringing people to death, and many, many, many times bringing them into death, and also bringing them out of life. He had the latest equipment that was given to him by the kings of the earth. They subsidized it, and they hired him to do this programming, to do all these experiments. You know, a lot of the technology that we see today, I believe the technology was there in the 50s when he was programming me. And the main thing that he calculated just the point of when to bring me into the death and when to bring me out. And so there were many, many, many instances of doing that, and that's how he would link then the demonic entities and create the network and create the web. And so that was my primary memory of him. I spent about 6 months with him putting the kind of a final touch, per se, on the programming after Bowlby and the attachments and things of that nature. And but I believe the very basis was to create the new bloodline, to create not just the Aryan race. You know, that was the German nomenclature, per se, was really to create a new race of the Nephilim. And that's what I believe that was his primary purpose.
Yeah, and I think, too, for those that are listening, when we talk about death, I mean, if you read Mengele and how he worked and practiced on the twins and, of course, dwarfs and those who are mentally retarded, he killed thousands of people in the process. But he would do all kinds of experiments, which I will not go into. But one was to, just like you say, bring them to a point of death, and even into death, and resuscitate. We know clinically that there's about a 4-minute window that if a person is put to death, that they have to be resuscitated before brain damage sets in. Of course, he knew all that, and of course, during that death, from what I understand and working with you, that's when there would be rituals that would be going on, and they would be channeling in spirits during this time. During that period of death, it creates a dimensional opening so that a part of your identity is actually can be interfaced and projected dimensionally into a global structure, as you refer to it, as a matrix. In fact, Isaiah 25, verse 7, it's referred to as where God says, "Upon this mountain, Mount Zion, I will swallow up the veil, the face of the covering that is over all the nations, the veil or the web that is woven over all the peoples." And so that's a real phenomenon, and it's Satan has constructed this and anchored it there on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But you also understand that if you cool a person's body down to, just to the point where they, as low as they can possibly cool the body down, you can extend the death window before you resuscitate them back. And so he knew all this. He learned all these techniques in Auschwitz. And of course, when he was released, I say released, when the war was over, and of course he was there in Germany for a while, and then he finally had to escape to Argentina because they were hunting for him. He of course has been in the United States. We'll touch on that a little bit later about the reports that he was never in the United States, which is a lot of hot air. It's ridiculous. But it's important to recognize that he was not only a doctor who was pursuing what he believed in his ideology, that which would advance the German eugenics cause and create a new species of humanity, which we know is the modern-day Nephilim, but he would not have called it that. That during this process, he was not only a doctor, but he was a world-class sorcerer, like Balaam in his day. And so that during the trauma, then there would be channeling in of spirits. And here's what people need to understand. The internal structuring of the DID is that human beings can be used to implement various types of trauma, electroshock and sensory deprivation and all kinds of ways of bringing horrific abuse to the body, hot and cold, and every kind of conflicting kind of experience. The human beings can do that. But when the person goes into traumatic shock and dissociates, or ultimately into death, during that time, it's the principalities and powers that actually do the structuring. So when we talk about trauma-based programming, it's not human beings that are creating this internal kingdom of Satan and as a dissociative realm. All this highly sophisticated structuring and the various constructs that are in, this is all a demonic architecture, a type of spiritual engineering, if you will, to create a weapon to be used against God's purpose, used against the church, and of course used in various ways in various stratas of society. So, Sally, is there anything else you want to comment on that before we hand the phone to somebody else so they could maybe comment on their connection, just introductory to with Mengele? Anything else? Any other comments?
No, just to follow up that you had mentioned that bringing the people to the death. That one of his favorite things that he would do that came to my mind was drowning. And medically, we know that a person who has drowned, that we're taught to go ahead and resuscitate because, if they're submerged into cooler water, then they can sustain life a little bit longer. So he knew that, and that was what he would seem to do quite often, was through cold water drownings and things of that nature.
Okay. All right. So who's next?
Hi, Georgianne. This is Juliana.
Hi, Juliana.
One thing that, in regard to Mengele, to his experiment with twinning with the twins in Auschwitz, he learned to force the egg and to split, to force twinning. And the Lord showed me early on, when I starting to recover my dissociative memories, that I was conceived in a petri dish and that it was very, very crowded. There was at least 30 or more embryos splitting off of me, and they placed at least 3 or 4 embryos together in the womb, in different wombs, and then killed one in the womb, killed one at birth, and then brought the identical twins together for programming later after birth. So, and also I think he was involved in twinning of people who are not identical twins, programming them together so that they were identical in their programming and linked together through simultaneous deaths and things like that. But he was involved in my life from birth onward, and many different times. And what I remember of him too is, as like the other said, that he's just it's like he was just fully demon-possessed. He was like, he would vacate and spirits were there, and he was just very evil. So that's what I remember.
Let me just comment on, you mentioned conception, you mentioned birth. It's really important that people who hear this, might ask the question, how could you know these things? We're not talking about memories. We're talking about the God of Daniel chapter 2, verse 22 is still alive and well. And if you'll remember in Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and he went to the wise men and he said, I want you to tell me the dream and its interpretation. Well, nobody could do so. But when God finally revealed it, because it was a matter of life and death, Daniel praised the Lord and he said to the Lord that the Lord knows profound and hidden things, and he knows what's in the darkness. And so you couple that together with the function of neshama, that is, not the human spirit, but it's an attribute of the inbreathed life of God, which occurs right at conception. When God formed Adam from the dust of the ground, he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. That's Genesis 2:7. That breath, that neshama, has attributes. And according to Job 30, I think it's in 31, I'll just look that up quickly so that it might relieve any of the those that may have a question, how can a person know? This is what we refer to as an epistemological question. It's a good question, actually. How can one know? First of all, I'll read Proverbs chapter 20, verse 27, since Julie made mention of what took place at conception, what took place at birth. And so in reading from Proverbs 20, verse 27, I'll read that. It's in the New American, the word is translated spirit. So often it'll be ruach. The Hebrew word ruach is translated spirit, and also the term neshama is translated spirit. They're related, but they're not exactly the same. In Proverbs 20, verse 27, it says, the spirit of man is the lamp of the Lord. Only in this case, it's not ruach, it's neshama. The neshama of man, that inbreathed life that comes only from God, with Adam at his creation, and with every human being at conception, not birth, at conception. The neshama of man, notice, is the lamp of Yahweh. The lamp of Yahweh. Notice its function, searching all the innermost parts of his being. Now, when does that begin? At the moment of conception. So as we turn to Job, we see a reference to the attributes of neshama. Elihu, who has been waiting to speak, as Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar have been harassing Job and trying to interpret his suffering as being rooted in some unconfessed sin, basically, and they were all wrong. Some of them had excellent theology. It just didn't apply to Job. And Elihu, who was younger and didn't have the history or experience, he waited until the three so-called friends of Job had finished their discourse, and then Job finished his discourse, and then Elihu speaks up. And he says in verse 6 of Job 32, Job 32:6, Elihu says, I am young in years and you are old, referring to, of course, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Therefore I was shy and afraid to tell you what I think. I thought age should speak, and increased years should teach wisdom. But it is a spirit in man, that's ruach, the spirit in man, and the breath, the neshama of the Almighty gives them understanding. Neshama gives them understanding. The Hebrew there is discernment, the ability to discriminate. So this is how people can know what happened to them. We don't know this if we don't have a trauma history. But when you're trying to help people and resolve people who have a history of trauma, then they have to know what happened to them in those areas where they're still held captive. I'll read one more verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, where it talks about God's wisdom being known to those who are wise, and that God has provided a special understanding and a knowledge of those who love him, that there's the ability to know, as we see in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 9, things that which eye has not seen or ear has not heard, and which have not entered the heart of man, that God has prepared for those who love him. Now, this is an interesting explanation. For to us, God revealed to them, that is, spiritual things that cannot be known by the natural mind, cannot be known just by the brain function. But to us, that is, spiritual things, is the context refers to, are revealed through the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, for the Spirit, notice, searches all things, even the depths of God. Now watch verse 11. For who among men knows the thoughts of a man, notice, except the spirit of the man? So the spirit of man, in association with the function of neshama, which is the lamp of the Lord, is, and coupled together with God who reveals profound and hidden things, makes it possible for people with this history to be able to recount and recall these areas in their life that where the trauma is anchored, where a lot of the demonization is anchored, and so this is how these people know these things. And a counselor who's experienced has some history in this, and I began to be more in touch with this in about 2003 to 2004, and it's grown. I now can clearly tell the difference between someone who is just speaking out of the area of the soul or just an altar versus that which represents neshama knowledge. I now can clearly see the difference, but it's taken years of practice and experience, but it's just an application of the Word of God, and so hopefully that is helpful. And if there's people out there that, well, I have done a brief paper that describes this in a little bit more detail, so if anyone's just interested, I'd be happy to send that to you so you can understand more of the function and attributes of neshama and how that works. But thank you, Julie. We'll go around and people can just contribute whatever is on your heart to in terms of your history and connection with Joseph Mengele. So who's next?
This is Susanna. Hi, Georgianne.
Hi, Susanna.
How are you tonight?
Fine.
Well, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my interfacing with him. I know that I was with Mengele in Europe, probably in Austria and Liechtenstein. He was kind of in and out doing some early fragmentation and deprivation type things with me. But the main emphasis, which is very fresh on me because I've even been working on it just the last couple of weeks here, has been spending 2 to 3 months with him right here in New York when I was 3 years old. And those memories that I have here with him are extremely vivid for me. And so here in New York, I know that the purpose was to interface me spiritually with some of the American families, some of the high powers here in the United States. I would be with him in programming within the context of the house where he was doing work with myself and Juliana at the same time. I can remember him sitting at a desk and playing music, and at the same time he had a little chair set up for me where he was ministering drugs, taking me in and out of death. And the programming associated with that was to show me that he and Satan had the power over life and death, not Jesus Christ. Because I was already born again at that time, had a transaction with the Lord Jesus Christ. So, and a part of this, too, is he would take me into death. Each time he'd let my spirit go a little longer and closer to the Lord, and then he'd pull me back. He'd take me a little further, and he'd pull me back. And the programming associated with this was that just that when the Lord came in return for his people, I would not be caught up in the air with the rest of them. I would be pulled back. That Satan, the ruler of this world, had more control over that than the Jesus Christ himself. And so it was extremely painful programming, and that's been very clear to me. He did a lot of electroshocking, too, and I would just fight him, trying not to split, but then he would continue on till I would just explode inside.
And then he would mock me, calling me a little airhead and things like that, and tie me to the little altar. He was training me to be a worshiper of Satan and Nimrod. He was preparing me, and he would leave me tied on the altar till I would call out to the gods to fix me, to come and take care of me, and things like that. And also, here in New York, there's just a center. There was this big center here. It's a religious retreat center. And he would take me up there, and I would be used in rituals and it being interfaced with these families and some of the political leaders of the time. I mean, world leaders would come here to this retreat center, and lots of rituals went down here. So that's what I remember.
Yeah,
and I was also present at his death as well.
Yeah.
So he all I can say is he was an extremely evil man with no conscience at all. No conscience.
Yes, and you mentioned that he just kind of mocked and prided himself as being the Lord over life and death, and that's how he's actually described by those at Auschwitz, that he prided himself as being the one in, the master over life and death. As people would come off of the cattle cars, he had a cane, he was dressed in his white gloves, and he would just say, he would point to the left or to the right or to the left or the right, and if the left was the ones who lived, about 20 or 30% lived, and you would go into a labor camp until you died or survived. A few did survive. But the majority, if they're old and they were just not capable of being productive, he would point to another direction, and they would be cremated. So, and he would whistle while he did this. In fact, some may not have actually seen the documentary by, I think was Ursula Pearl, who was his associate there at Auschwitz, and in that particular docudrama, which is very accurate, it's a true life story. The way Mengele is depicted in this docudrama called Out of the Ashes, people here, when they saw it, they said they captured his persona very accurately. But I thought, you mentioned New York, Susan. I thought, the times I've worked with you, Barbara, you have reported throughout the years that we've worked together, and I thought I'd just maybe ask you could come in and just talk about what you remember, your connection with him, because you have very specific and clear memories of him living in New York and you being with him, I understand. But, would you be ready to share a little bit about what your history and connection with him at this time, Barbara?
Sure. I think that, like Dan, my memories of Mengele were clear and were uncovered by psychologists, just working with other clinical psychologists before I was ever diagnosed SRADID. I just had trauma in my life that was dissociated. And I know that a large part of the trauma in my life that was dissociated was around kiddie porn. And one of the things that I remember most about being involved with kiddie porn would be this man who was called my uncle coming from New York, and he brought children with him. And when he came, he didn't participate in the kiddie porn, but he oversaw it. He directed it. And then he would take me back to his apartment in New York. It wasn't really an apartment, and it's Brooklyn. He lived in Brooklyn. And it was a part of my life for easily 6 to 10 years on a regular basis. And I've done enough now to even have conscious memory of how it happened, who brought me to this little out-of-the-way farm in Boonton Township. The different parts of me that would remember being in the car and going there. Remember being left there. A different part remembering being a part of the kiddie porn films and the snuff films. and a different part of me that would leave with Mengele. But what really amazes me is you were talking about when he first affected my life and twinning. And I don't think I understood until this afternoon when I was working through my life, working with James in Maryland, that how much he affected my life took place before I was ever even born. And I don't even need Neshama memories to make the connections, because I remember my mother, who gave birth to twins, me and my sister, who I grew up with. I don't need to have a recovered memory of my sister. She's my sister. She's my twin. But my mom, when I was a teenager, spoke about being pregnant and going through tests with doctors. I don't know if I should talk about this on the air or not, but it happened, and it happened to her. And she told me about the experiments the doctors did on her when she was pregnant, about putting poles up inside of her and never even telling her that she was going to have 2 babies, not one. And the truth of my sister being born with none of her appendages where they belonged, her back being shaped like the letter C, never being able to sit up, always in pain, and all because of the experiment that this doctor performed on my mother when she was pregnant. And that series of photos you laid before me, Doug. Maybe you don't remember it, because I'm sure I was one of many people that came to you from another state and in another state of mind. But I can never forget. I will never forget you laying those photographs on your coffee table, mostly bogus photographs. But then you laid down that photograph of Joseph Mengele. And I just looked at you and I said, he's my uncle. He's my uncle from New York. And even then I didn't know his name. I didn't know who he was. Like, why do you have a picture of my uncle from New York?
I remember that. Because I hadn't told you at the time, I hadn't even mentioned his name.
No. Oh, no. It was the very first day I was there. I flew into Oklahoma from New York. From New York. I flew in from New Jersey to Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And you didn't think to do that until I started talking to you about my twin sister.
Yeah. Well, this is real validating. I mean, I just forgotten that, but now I just is very clear. Yeah, I mean this shows that I'm not leading I'm not leading you. I'm doing this in such a way that it either has an effect on you or not. I did not lead you in any of this process.
Oh, you said nothing. You didn't even think to put down the photographs until I started talking to you about my sister. Not a sister who was taken from me at birth and introduced later on in life, but a constant guilt trip, a living, breathing guilt trip for this could have been you. Look what they did to her. Look what you escaped. And a testimony that's not a recovered memory of my mother.
Yeah.
Mengele's effect on my life began before I was born.
So how would you define that? How would you
never
describe
forget
that?
those trips into New York City with him.
Yeah.
And the days and the weeks that I spent there. Oh, the piano. How can you forget the piano?
Would he sing and like Dan described, sing while he played the piano?
Yeah, he sang hymns.
Say he sang hymns.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
He sang hymns. He played classical music. And in death, since you have to take responsibility for your actions, sure, most of it's channeled to you. Oh, but the major part of it is clinging to life when you're going to die. And the powers and principalities you call into yourself because your soul and your spirit and your body is dying and you're fighting to live. You're fighting for breath. You're fighting for life. And you'll take anything that's offered to you, anything at all, and all of the principalities that come into your being. You call them. You will them. Save me.
Yeah. And see, Barbara, that's the plan. I mean, that's a whole setup. That's a scenario that's structured because that's exactly what they wanted you to do. Yeah. Well, I know this is not easy, Barbara, and I do appreciate it. We're not done. We're just going to trust the Lord as to whatever's important for history and any other survivors out there that may have been maybe afraid to talk about this, that are in this age group, that Uncle Pepe or whatever name he went by for you as Uncle. I know just even recently here with Connie, I think it was today, there's a tremendous history where he was brought into your life, Connie, and when you're, of course, your biological parents are European. King George is your father, like with Dan, like with Barbara, you share the same father, I think different mother. But you were brought to this country and placed in a surrogate family, etc. But how, in remembering Dr. Mengele, what stands out to you, having already heard some of these people share, Connie, what would you like to bring in at this point in terms of the history that you've had with Dr. Mengele?
Well, first of all, it was interesting to hear Barbara talking about him as being uncle, because that's the way I knew him, too. I had actually written that down today. And also when she shared about how he would sing hymns, that was also another thing I wrote down. Because
let me just stop right here. Have you and Barbara, have you ever talked about this or collaborated on this?
Oh, no, I didn't know anything she shared tonight. I hadn't heard that part of any of her history.
Yeah. I knew that, but I just wanted the listeners to hear that. Go ahead.
As far as Mengele, I don't remember a time in my life when he wasn't a pretty intricate part of my life up till 79. Some of my earliest memories, well, like with Julie, as I get more of myself back, I can see that my whole conception, birth, was very, very planned, and he was an integral part of that. But on a real practical level, hey, I'm going to do this. Some of my earliest memories are when he would use extreme heat and extreme cold, bright lights, and then utter darkness, like just real using electroshock as he takes you in and out of these various states. Freezing a person was a big thing he liked to do, then take you into extreme heat afterwards. One of the first...
Now, when you're describing these extremes and this trauma, this is causing dissociation and splitting, and of course, spirits are being channeled during these traumatic events.
Yes, at a core level, it was creating this extreme dichotomy, so that there would always be this internal conflict within me. So, like, the way he would do that at a very young age was using colors. He would come in, he would do a color chart, and he'd teach you what the different colors were. And you knew that you better remember them really well, or there'd be punishment. So I'd have them in my little mind. I think I had these 3 little colors all figured out. And then the next time he'd come in, he'd say, okay, point to pink, and I'd point to the pink. And he'd slap me across the face, and he'd say, that's not pink. What's wrong with you? I told you this, and he would actually be lying, because I had remembered him correctly. But through the process, never trust yourself. Never trust anything that your mind tells you. You can never trust yourself. Truth will be found in another person, those other persons being people that are programmers, handlers that are put into your life. They're the only ones you can trust. Never trust yourself. If you're inclined to think that
this never happened to you, you can go talk to them, and they'll assure you it never happened to you. So, I mean, it's like in my core self, it always was very, very conflicted. Well, when I was brought to the U.S. when I was 3, I was placed in this Mennonite family, and they lived in Hartville, Ohio at the time. And he came to stay with my parents for a very extended period of time. He passed himself off as an evangelist, and he actually went to church with us. He went to the potlucks. He would go to, we'd have hymn sings on Sunday nights. He'd go to the hymn sings. He loved to sing, and he could harmonize beautifully. We didn't use the piano in the church itself, but in our home we had one. My dad bought one later on in life so that he could play it. And
did your surrogate family, did they know who he was?
My dad knew who he was. My mother did not.
So he could be there because of all the dissociation and all the stuff in the family. He could pass off as somebody that they wouldn't know.
He was the man. I always called him the man of many faces. Like I saw him where he would have white hair and look very, very old when he was in his 30s. I would see him with a mustache and without. He would he would dress as an Amish man sometimes. He dressed as a Mennonite when he was with us, because the men wore certain kinds of suit coats and so forth. So I always called him the man of many colors, many coats, many hats, because he could pass himself off as he needed to. So in my earlier years, that was in Hartville. When we moved to Minnesota, he came there, and we had a third story, and I've talked about this on one of the other programs. On the third story, that was his headquarters, and there were people brought in. We were a part of a mission. My dad was actually a pastor, so he would take him around with him and just pass him off as an evangelist. When we got to Minnesota, he was in the 3rd floor, and they had we were connected with a mission that was up in Canada, and we would house these missionary pilots that would come down to the States for more of their training. And so when we would take him to church with us, when we had, like, all the Mennonite churches in that area would get together, my dad would just pass him off as one of the pilots. But there were times that he was there that nobody would know that he was there except my dad and I. Now, my surrogate father didn't know him in the way that I did. There were things that he knew about, but there was a lot more that I knew about than he did. So he knew a certain level. He knew that this man, he knew I wasn't his own daughter. He knew that this man came from Germany. He knew that this man was a programmer. My dad would organize the youth rallies and the mengele.
You're talking about your surrogate dad now, right?
Yes, my surrogate father, yes. But what he didn't know was there was a lot of stuff that went on that he didn't even know about, that was to be kept strictly secret between Joseph Mengele and myself.
Yeah, well, here's what I want to just bring up now. Okay, you're in this surrogate family. What is the connection between your father, King George VI, and Joseph Mengele? Because, I mean, the reason why Mengele is here in the United States is not because of your surrogate family and your Mennonite family. I mean, he's employed by King George VI. Is that correct, or is that done?
Yes. King George VI died when I was 3. And before that happened, when I was about 1.5, George handed me over to what I call Mr. P. I knew him as my father, but he was Mr. P. He was, for all practical purposes, I saw him as my father because... Yeah.
Well, let me just go public. This is, Mr. P is referred to as the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip. So we'll go public with this, and you know what? We've got a lot of corroborative testimonies, and if he happens to hear this, go for it. Do whatever you have to do. We're not going to back down. This is who you are, Prince Philip. You are the handler that took over after King George VI died. We know who you are, Prince Philip, and we do not fear you, nor any of you in your family, because we belong to the Most High, and you cannot touch us without going through Jesus Christ. So get the message. Go ahead.
Well, you had asked something. I don't remember what you asked.
It was just the fact that he was a worker. He was hired by King George for the Sixth, and then you were handed off to Prince Philip to be your primary handler, and so Mengele would then be directly working under the aegis of Philip then.
Yes, absolutely, yes. He was paid by Philip and other world leaders at that time.
Yes.
Yes.
I know this is, and I know there are others in that family line that have been recently involved with Barbara. We know one of his sons. So, these so-called royal families are anything but royal, okay? I have a particular thing I would like to say what they are royal, but I won't do it. I'll spare the audience because my blood is already boiling when I think about it. But, go ahead. You were going to say anything else?
That's okay. Go ahead.
I was just thinking that, I'll just throw this out. I mean, if you have anything else you want to share, I know that throughout your life, we're going to talk about how he ended. There's the official story of how his life ended, and then there's the collaborative report of how, that we came across years ago about how he ended. It was actually a ritual sacrifice, which he willingly yielded himself to give his life. Yeah. But before I do that, you go right ahead, Connie, because I think you had something else. Because I mentioned, the involvement of the royal family and how, how Mengele was really, really working for them. Is that correct?
Yes. And I, as sick as it may sound, I had kind of a love-hate relationship with him because he could be very charming and pretend to be very compassionate. But he always had an ulterior motive, which I found out as I got older. But when I was younger, I was drawn into that. It's like, on one hand, he could do all these nice things for you. Then he could turn around and, like, I had to be by his side when he was taking younger children through what I called their paces.
That's technique.
Huh?
That is technique.
Right. Right. Yeah, and so as he was doing that, I would have to have the clipboard there, and he would rattle off all these little notes that I was supposed to be making for him. But what I was always struck by was how he could do it in a way that was so, like, what he was doing was so horrific, but his face would never change. He would always be very calm. He would be very, he would sing. He would sing about things like Jesus loves the little children of the world, things like that,
Unbelievable.
And so for me, I just had a terrible time with it because I couldn't wrap my mind around it. I was always trying to figure things out, and I'd really internalized him. It's kind of like this, even though he's no longer alive and hasn't been for years, it's like, for all practical purposes, it's like he's inside my head and I still hear him, And I just today got to, like, the internal Mengele, and that I'm not him. I'm not him. I'm sorry. I don't think I can talk anymore.
That's okay. You've been doing really good. I know. We'll give you a break. But thank you, because I know that this, recalling, we're not just, you're not just recalling a person. We're talking about someone who is probably one of the, when he was on trial, when his name was brought up, when they captured Eichmann, and they brought up Dr. Joseph Mengele, Eichmann froze.
Yeah.
I mean, the others were afraid. When he was at Auschwitz, he led. I mean, when all the various, the other doctors were there, he was always present. He was very zealous. He was always involved, even though when he could have had some time off and the other doctors could take over some of the projects, he was there. I mean, he wanted to be in the forefront, and he was dressed in his white gloves and his black boots, and he was like really proud of what he was doing. So he really embodied the Auschwitz mentality of medical genocide. I mean, when you read Robert Lifton's book and Nazi Doctors, people, the psychology of medical killing and genocide, he makes it very clear. You cannot get your mind around this man. I mean, because he's a completely a demonic personality. I think that is one of the ways in which he's described it. So this level of evil, he's not split into different parts. This is a whole person invested in evil, and what he's doing, he believes what he's doing because he has the Nazi ideology. This is the way to lead the German people. He was like the avant-garde. He represents a person in the forefront who would help bring Germany to be the purest and the ruling race on planet Earth. He really believed this. And so it's hard for people that, I don't think any of us are normal until we get to heaven with Jesus, but whatever relative normalcy we have, I think this man is difficult. I don't think there's a way that you can even be comprehended.
And I wanted to add something else. And I was getting connected with all of this, a bunch of this, before I ever met you. For those that want to say this is a Doug Riggs phenomenon, you weren't even in my life. In fact, the first time I knew there was something there is somebody was playing a video, and it had Joseph Mengele on. All I saw was the boots, and I heard the whistling, and I went into a trance, and I couldn't walk. I was with this counselor, and I could hear people, but I couldn't move any part of my body.
Yeah.
And
you were triggered then.
I was triggered, and I didn't even know who it was. They didn't tell me. But they had a sense because of things I was sharing them about my grandpa and about my surrogate father and about different things. They sensed that, and I was describing certain program things that I had been through. And so he had this video, and he didn't tell me who it was or anything. He just started playing it, and I went into this trance, and it took quite a while for them to get me back out of it.
Yeah, I remember that. And when Connie's referring to a trance, it's when you have dissociative states. When you're triggered, you drop into these areas that have been dissociated, and when you're in them, you're actually in the very event and the place that represents the individual that we're talking about in Mengele. I mean, it's just part of the process of reaccessing these areas of the mind and the history that have been dissociated. Before I go to, I'm not following, I gave you all a kind of a printout here, just kind of a general questionnaire, but before I go to, I wanted to look at question number 4, or point number 4. Before I do that, is different ones have been talking. Does anyone want to just come in and just share anything before I go on to something else? Anyone?
No, not down here, Doug.
Okay, go ahead. Did you have something, Dan?
Well, I was thinking just to kind of, as I have had the memories I have and learned more about it and read about Mengele, and then and just which confirms so many of the facts that I had reported, and I had not at the time that I began having the memories, I was not aware of anyone having had reported Mengele, or even aware of really who he was at all. So the memories I have came myself, Just one thing that I've learned, which puts things for me in a better perspective, and that is the ideology I believe behind what Mengele was doing. And I've read individuals who said that his experiments were chaotic and had no scientific meaning whatsoever. And I heartily disagree with them, because I believe that when you look at what he was doing, he was experimenting with pain, and he was also experimenting with taking a person up to that point of death where he can bring him back. Much of what I've read about from the camps had to do simply with inflicting pain upon a person up to the point of death. That was as bizarre and as horrific. That, I believe, was clearly what he was intending to do. His experimentation many of them had to do with different aspects of eugenics, but I think much of it had to do with inflicting pain in such a way as to slowly take a person up to a point of death and then be able to bring him back. Now,
when you say up to the point of death, actually into death.
Right. And now, to do that, you're going to take people into death and not be able to bring them back. That's all a part of the experimentation of how far. And also, of course, much of the eugenics with reference to twinning. That's why he was so interested in them. And I believe that from what I've read and then from the memories I've had, I believe he was fully invested in what he was doing because of what I call a New Age philosophy with reference to the belief of the fact that at the end of this physical life, the person can be released from the physical realm and translated into a spiritual realm or into a higher level. Yeah. I believe that he was working toward that which he thought, as many of them did. I believe Hitler himself, that's why he committed suicide, not because he was losing, but because he was coming to the point of the end of what they were attempting to do and ready to move, as they thought, to the next level, and that was being released from their body. And I know the memories around when King George VI was, the news accounts say that he died from a lung condition, complications, but I fully remember being involved in his ritual death.
Yes.
And he willingly submitted to it. Just like Mengele in 1979 willingly submitted to the ritual death. I think it's because of the ideology behind his life, as well as King George, and that is that coming to a point of the completion of the work here, therefore it's time to be released from this physical body and then released into that next level, the higher level of life.
Yeah. So you mentioned 1979. I don't remember how many people were there, but I remember when we first came across this years ago, there was I remember working with you people, and I don't remember specifically where you would intersect with this, Barbara, but over through the years, there was a very, very large ritual that took place in Tulsa in 1979 prior to the formation of our assembly, but there was something that happened in that context in 1979, which I think first began to unfold with Dan when he remembered being in Indiana, and I don't even know if he knew at the time about Mengele, but if it was the identity, but of this, the ritual killing of Mengele, where there were 13 representations of the ruling heads of what is often called the Illuminati. They were there. That he willingly submitted himself to the ritual murder that was executed by top 13 representatives of the Illuminati. That you were there, Dan. You remember that. I don't know of Connie, Sally. I think some of you. But any comment on that event and what the purpose of that was? And let me just say this: the official report is that he died of drowning, of a heart attack while swimming in 1979. That's the report. Although there was a rumor that he had been murdered, but they have no way. That's all that comes out. And then when they exhumed his bones in 1983, they identified his remains, is what the report is. But I believe the corroborative testimony that in his death there was a purpose and something was released that has affected all of us as an assembly through the years during that event in 1979. So let's talk about that a little bit in terms of how he really died. So Dan, why don't you just lead, and if anyone wants to follow up with what you remember this event, go ahead. But why don't you just lead? Just go ahead, and you've already alluded to it, Dan. But go ahead and just talk about it.
Well, actually, I was in the military, and I was stationed at Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana, for a period of time for schooling. And I remember it was a Sunday morning, I believe it was in August, that I got up to run, and it was fairly early, and there was a particular route that I went. And this particular morning, when I turned down a kind of a trail, it was particularly dark, and I could barely see. I remember afterwards, in my mind, just finishing the race, and then really being afraid to the point of trembling, and thinking, well, I'm not going to do that again.
Because you didn't remember at the time what the fear
I
was
just
about.
remember, okay, yeah, I got through that trail, and I couldn't see anything. The darkness was so dark. But I do remember kind of trembling when I get back, thinking, I'm not going to go that route again. And
that's all you remembered at the time.
That's right. Yeah, I had no memories. But years later, whenever whenever I began to, when the memories began to surface, then I began, and it takes a little bit to put all this together. But literally, as the memory I have it now, as I'm running down that road, Mengele came out of the shadows. Of course, he's not the same Mengele from 18 months. He's older, and he had a mustache at the time, but it was still him. He came out of the shadows, and he had something in his hand that he held out toward me. And as he did, then these 13 individuals came out in a semicircle behind him, and then there was just great darkness all around, as far as I could tell, around behind that. But he held out his hand, and in his hand, what I saw was like little light bodies, luminaries. It was almost like a small universe, and I put the word to it, the morning star. It was like he was holding out to me the morning star, and as he's holding it out, and it's like it is a living thing that fits in his hands. And as he's holding it out, then these 13 all raise their daggers. He's facing me, but it's like he knows what's happening. They raise their daggers, and they all, just at the same time, strike him with them. And it's like, because there's something in me that is connected.
You're bonded to him.
Right, affectionately from back at 18 months forward. It's as if, and part of what the programming for me was that I would extend myself out, as if I could extend myself out over individuals to protect them. The deception on my part was that I could extend myself out over someone and cover them in a non-physical way and protect them. And so this is happening. He's there, and it's as if I throw myself out over him in a sense to try and protect him. But of course, it didn't protect him. But it's all that he had, identified with him in a spiritual way. It's as if I took it all into myself. The thing that I'm trying to do is to save him. It's like a knee-jerk reaction. I'm not a child anymore, but in that dissociated state, seeing the harm coming to him, and just extending myself out over and trying to pull him into myself in a protective way. But in doing that, it's like I took into myself the morning star, that celestial-looking representation that I could see in his hand.
And do you think that in the release of his death, that there was some kind of a release of that least which represented him, and you took into yourself the angel of death as kind of a wrapping around that which would represent, as we've talked about before, the end-time morning star? It was to be a wrapping of death around that which would ultimately, 2 Peter 1, verse 19, the release and the emergence of the morning star in these last days. Did you kind of see that was kind of the setup for you to kind of represent a wrapping and the surrounding of that which was yet to be, morning star testimony wrapped in death?
Oh, yeah. If we go back to 18 months and everything leading up to 15 to 18 month period, I mean, the ritual activity that I most remember is just being put into death and brought back, put into death and brought back, so that years later, as I would try to work through this, all I could see would be fragmentation, dust. I felt like my life was dust. All that I was in a spiritual way was just represented in dust. I didn't do anything with Mengele, or, as some of the girls talked about, having, jobs and different things like that. I just was taken into death and brought back, taken into death. And each time there's a shattering, a shattering, a shattering. And then the whole, at that young age, the representation of the need that was presented to me from the book of the Gospel of John was that I to be the friend of Jesus, I needed to die on behalf of his friends.
Yeah.
And just the quote training and programming was that I needed to take death on behalf of the friends of Jesus, and that was embracing death, and it's embracing spiritual death. So it's like going into death and coming out and embracing death, going into death and embracing death, and embracing spiritual death, because Satan, he's the epitome of spiritual death.
So now tie this, kind of just bring that up and just contextualize that with the ritual killing of Mengele.
That's right. And so here, I've got a lifetime of that, and here I am on this trail out there, and here's Mengele about to be put to death, and that's like extending myself out to bring, in a way to protect him, but all I'm doing is I'm bringing into myself the spirits that are identified with him, which is identified with death. So the very, in 1979, as an adult, kind of near the end of the culmination of these things, bringing into myself, not willingly as it were, but bringing into myself the spirit of death itself from the man who was the angel of death. And as a Christian, identified with the body of Christ, being identified with spiritual death to that extent. I mean, I saw it as a seal to prevent the morning star from arising.
Wow, it's going to be a big bite for some people to take a hold of. But if you go to the Bite Show and the series we did on Jesus Christ as the bright and morning star, if you go through and you listen to that series, it's that emerging testimony as an end-time remnant that Satan was targeting in advance. Remember, Satan prepositioned himself in the land of Canaan prior to the children of Israel coming in, so that Satan knows how to preposition himself. So he's prepositioning himself for that end-time company, I mean, not just our assembly, but whoever would make up a part of this end-time army of God that would embody the Jesus Christ as the bright morning star. This particular ritual was to seal off that which would be in a representative way. The very purpose for our coming into existence is a local assembly. That's what we call our assembly Morning Star Testimony, because we desire in a representative way to make up a part of that remnant. But staying with this particular event, is there anyone else out there that could fill in as to what you remember and the part that you had in the ritual killing of Yosef Mengele?
I can. Doug, I was there as well, and I remember the day we worked on this. I was not at Morning Star at that time. I mean, I don't think there was one as our testimony.
No, there wasn't. There wasn't a morning.
So that I think what I remember about that ritual was that in us that would be drawn out towards wanting to be a part of that Morning Star testimony. That desire in us was then sealed in death. It's like an essence, a part of our essence, because we were there, we were participating in it. It sealed that desire in us. And I know that when I got to that and saw that, I really prayed to take back all of my humanity that was released in and through that ritual killing with him. And I also was very aware of when his spirit was being released, it was being passed on to the next in line.
What do you mean by the next in
line?
line?
By Krista's father,
Okay, yeah, because there were other doctors
well,
that were trained.
It's like I was a conduit for that. I don't want to go into a lot of details, but it's like I was a conduit of the spirits of death coming from Mengele into the next in line.
Okay, that would be his protege.
Right.
Yeah, I think there were a number, but there was one that ascended to the highest place and was incorporated into him all the protocols of Jean Piaget and Dr. Bowlby and of course Mengele, and he's still out there today. But thank you. Is there anyone else that wants to add to this?
Barbara. Only
go ahead, Barbara.
It was not the same role because I had absolutely no desire to emulate Christ. I was not only not a Christian, I was a very committed and on board with my whole heart Luciferian. I was never one of these Luciferians that didn't want to do these things. I was never one of these Luciferians that, in my heart of hearts, knew God and wanted to be with him. I hated God. I hated God. And I hated Mengele. And I hated him when I would be submitted to torture while he sang flippin' hymns. And I hated everything he was singing about. And I hated his being, and I hated his person. And I remember being one of those that put the knife in his back. And I took into myself his hatred of mankind.
Mm.
My memories of being his protege wasn't holding a clipboard. It was holding a knife.
Yeah.
It was dissecting people while they were still alive and emulating his stone face that showed no emotion one way or the other.
Yes.
So I was glad to end his sorry ass of a life.
Yes.
I was glad to put the knife into his back. And it's really weird because everything that Dan was trying to protect, I simultaneously was trying to destroy. And I felt a victory, actually, over Dan when he died. Because it was like I ruled, I won. He's dead. I mean, I know that both he and I and everyone else there, we're all just playing out our assigned roles. But I was glad to do.
Yeah. And it's hard for people to understand this. I mean, until a person works through all that which represents the dividedness and the different ways in which, whether it's you're connecting with Mengele or you're connecting with one of the members of the royal family, until all the humanity is here and allowed to come into a place where it's really in a real redemptive experience. People cannot understand this. In fact, when I'm working with people that have this history, I don't say, well, have you forgiven Dr. Mengele? What I first of all have to find out is where the rage is, where the anger is, and make sure that which represents all the dissociative anger, the dissociative rage, is fully excavated and brought forward. Otherwise, there's not going to be any healing, because anybody can say, oh, yeah, I forgive Dr. Mengele or that kind of thing, and not even touch the dissociative rage that would be there. So when people hear someone like you sharing these kinds of things, I fully understand. I say fully understand. I can, as far as I can without being in your shoes, Barbara, is that, we're dealing with probably one of the most notorious people that has ever lived. I personally believe if you were to place Hitler and Mengele side by side, Hitler would be afraid of Mengele. I really believe that. I can't prove that, but when I've read and heard of Hitler, what I've read and heard about Mengele, Mengele would have a level of power, a level of sorcery, a level of personal connection with Satan that would surpass that of Hitler. But that's just my opinion, and it's, whether it's that way or not, that's just my assessment as a counselor. We're at 8:30, and I want to ask Georgianne, would this be a good time to break to go into part two?
Well, I wanted to bring up something.
Go ahead.
It's on a different level, Doug, but in marriages where the husband abuses the wife and beats her terribly, breaking bones, just terrible.
Yeah.
And she's afraid to leave him. What happens? He's all forgiving and all on his knees with a bouquet of flowers and a box of chocolates. Oh, forgive me. It'll never happen again. And they go into a honeymoon period, and then wham, it happens.
Yeah.
And she's terrified to leave. It just, oh my God.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, we're not talking about ritual abuse. What we're talking about is people would say the psychology. It is the human dynamics.
Yeah.
Where in a marriage like that, there is often those who are abused marry abused people. I mean, if they have a history, if it's generational,
Yes.
there's an intermarriage thing. There's an attraction. So in this situation, let's say the husband was most likely grew up in an abusive family, and so he's acting out all of his unresolved issues on his wife.
Yeah.
Because she's safe. He can project his anger in a way that he was never allowed to growing up. It doesn't justify it. But what happens is that there's a codependency. In other words, the wife says, well, you know, if I could just be better, maybe he will change.
Yeah.
Or, you know, if I just hang in here longer, or if she's a Christian, I'll continue to pray, and then he will change. Whenever there's this kind of abuse, she needs to be removed,
Yes.
and there needs to be a separation. I didn't say necessarily a divorce, but a separation until these issues can be resolved. Her codependency, where she's made to feel responsible in some way for his condition. So the codependency issues is what keeps that person bonded and never able to get out of the situation. There needs to be intervention when that kind of situation that you described is going on.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminded me of that when the lady said that, you know, Mengele was kind and, you know, and then he would turn and be vicious.
Yeah.
It's a similar dynamic.
Well, here's the difference. You take in a dysfunctional family or in a married person will go into a rage. That may not be calculated.
Yeah.
It's just a part of his pathology. With Mengele, he could do this and be fully conscious and know what he's doing.
Yes.
So there's a huge difference between the kind of psychological dynamics that's going on with someone like a Mengele, and then when you're talking about a dysfunctional relationship, because this goes way, way beyond just being dysfunctional.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I would say so. Oh, my gosh.
Yes.
Well, this is being recorded on March 5th, 2011, Saturday, and move to part 2. And God bless everyone that's listening.